All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We're pleased to have David Clingingsmith with us here today from Case Western. David and I were classmates at Harvard, so I'm happy to have him here. David is interested in applied micro, labor, behavioral history.
Development. I don't, yeah.
And has had papers published in the QJE and the Journal of Human Resources. So, and today he'll be telling us about an experiment looking at mental accountants.
Thanks very much, Joyce, and it's really great to be here. And thanks everyone for coming to the talk. I very much look forward to your comments on the paper. It's one I'm currently doing some revisions to, so it's a great time to present it and get comments from folks. So I like to begin this talk with an anecdote about kind of how the idea for the experiment came to me. But the anecdote itself actually reminds me of an appearance that the comedian Louis Black made on The Daily Show in 2008, and this was during the height of the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. And so, as part of his bit, he recalled an interview that he had seen on the news, a reporter talking to a shopper about what she had purchased and how much it had cost, and the shopper said, "Well, I bought this can of beans and it cost $10 billion." And Louis Black said, $10 billion? I didn't know they had Whole Foods in Zimbabwe. and so the reason that reminds me of the anecdote is that the anecdote took place in the checkout line at Whole Foods. So I don't know how many of you shop at Whole Foods either sometimes or regularly. But often when you're checking out, the person who's your cashier will ask you if you would like to donate to a charity like the Whole Kids Foundation or maybe the Whole Planet Foundation. And I really find this annoying. I don't like to be buttonholed in line, by the cashier asking me to give money to something. So I try to sort of make it say no as a matter of principle. But this one time I was asked. I said, sure, I'll give $3 to the Whole Kids Foundation. And then I was walking to my car and I was like, why did I relent? Why did I give that time when I haven't given on so many other occasions? And I thought about it for a while. And then it occurred to me that as I was in line, I had been flipping through my phone and got an email that said that a rather large reimbursement for an experiment that I'd conducted, reimbursement from the university of a couple $1,000s, had been deposited in my account. So I was feeling, wow, I'm rich. Even though this is, of course, money that I had fronted myself to conduct my experiment, I felt particularly flush at that moment. And so that kind of got me thinking about how we think about, how we think about our sources of income and how that might have sort of influence our pro-social altruistic behavior. And so what I decided to do was to ask this question via an experiment. And so the question is, how does shifting the composition of someone's resources between money they've earned and money they would perceive as a windfall affect their generosity? And many of you may have the sort of intuition that people are going to be more generous with money that they get as a windfall, as say from playing the lottery or winning money at the casino, so forth, than money they've earned. But actually, if you think about, what does neoclassical theory say about this sort of a question? Neoclassical micro tends to takes income to be fungible. So it really shouldn't matter what source our income comes from. We're going to kind of decide what to do with it, feeling that we can shift it from one purpose or purchase to another in a completely free manner. So it really shouldn't matter where the income comes from in the neoclassical model. In contrast, in the mental accounting model or framework, if you prefer to call it that, which is due to Richard Thaler, 1999, we may treat income from different sources as at least partially infungible. And we may also have a sense of appropriate uses for those different sources of income. So we may think that it's more appropriate for me to share money that I have not had to work to earn. Or we may think that, if I do a little bit of gambling and win some money, that's a good reason to go splurge on a dinner out that I might not have had otherwise. And the mental accounting idea also thinks about not just the sources of income, but the uses to which they're put. So we may have, and that's not particularly relevant to my talk today, but we may have a sort of sense of how much money should I spend on gas each month, and we may treat that as a somewhat fixed quantity. Another important part of the mental accounting idea is the notion that the decisions that we make are narrowly bracketed. And so rather than doing a kind of global reoptimization every time we're kind of presented with a situation in which we need to make a choice, we think about a much narrower set of trade-offs when we do that. And so that's particularly relevant to the design of the experiment I'm going to talk about. And so the goal that I came up with for the experiment was to sort of think of a function that would describe how much someone is going to share with another person as a function of their windfall and earned income. And so we would maybe think of that in sort of if we thought of that in a narrow bracketing term, what we would be, say, thinking of is that people in an experimental setting in which they could earn money or receive it as a windfall are going to be thinking about how do I allocate that money to another person if I'm asked to. And so the idea would be to try and map out this function a little bit by varying windfall and earned income for people, and sort of seeing how their sharing decisions, their giving decisions change as those amounts change. And in particular, we can look at, it's interesting to look at some of the derivatives of this function. So for example, in the neoclassical model, the marginal willingness to give out of an additional dollar should be the same whether that additional dollar comes to you as earnings or windfall. That's just what fungibility means. So that's something that we would like, that the design of the experiment is going to allow us to test. The second 2 points here relate to mental accounting. If a strong variety of mental accounting were to hold, and this is my term, not Thaler's, maybe it's the case that if we have two separate sources of earnings, we treat them, completely independently from one another. So I sort of look at my windfall earnings and decide how much to give out of that. Look at the earnings that come from work, decide how much to give out of that, and the level of either of those don't really affect, sort of my marginal willingness to give in either account. Or it could be that there's something, there's some interdependence between the accounts, so that this partial derivative might be positive or negative. And that's just sort of where I started out, was kind of, let's develop a framework where I can look at some of these questions. There's an existing literature that I draw on that shows that for a given amount of money, if people get it as a windfall, they're going to share more of it than if they get it as as earnings. And so that literature made me sort of think I was on the right track in kind of looking at a setup like this. But I wanted to sort of see, I want to see what happens when there are mixtures of windfall and earnings, which I think is, if we sort of think about how we might, how this mental accounting idea might work in the wild. Generally, people will have income that they might want to classify as windfall, or income that they might want to classify as earnings. And so I'm going to use the sort of core of the experiment is to use a dictator game, and what I'll talk about now is just a little bit about what recent work on the dictator game that sort of that's related to this phenomena of mental accounting says, and sort of how in a way that provides a framework for the question. The question that I'm asking. So, as you probably know, the dictator game is a simple scenario in which one person is endowed with an amount of money, and that money might come to them from earning. They may earn it. They may be given it as a result of a lottery. It may just be a sort of fixed endowment, and then they're presented with a choice. Where they have to say some amount between 0 and E to give. They're given a choice to give to another anonymous person, typically anonymous. They have to say how much they'd like to give. And so with this, in this very sort of simple, basic version of the game, typically 80% of people will share something, and the mean amount that they share might be a quarter of the endowment. And so that's not a sort of that's not a meta-analysis set of numbers. That's a kind of hand-waving. I kind of think that that's what it's about, like set of numbers. But that behavioral pattern is not really very robust to changing small elements about the game that you would think shouldn't matter. And I'll talk about what some of those ways are in a second. And so this instability, if you'd like, of how people behave in this simple game, has been used as a reason to kind of doubt the literature on social preferences from lab experiments in general by Levin and List. Sort of saying, well, if there are underlying preferences about underlying preferences about sharing or giving to other people, the fact that this game is not very robust means that it's not really informative about it. There's another set of literature that I kind of am fitting into, where people have said, well, let's look at these ways in which the game is not robust, and let's see if we can learn something about how how giving behavior works in order to understand how these decisions are made better. And so one example why you might want to sort of know something about that is, say charities often do things like direct mail solicitations or phone solicitations that have a very low hit rate. A couple of percent or something like that of people will respond to a direct mail. I find them terrible. You're going to get the feeling that I'm really annoyed by anything having to do with asking me for money, but I'm also really annoyed by the volume of mail I get that I just end up having to throw away. But I'm actually a nice guy. I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression.
I'll vouch for that.
Thank you. So it would be interesting to know what are these contextual factors that might influence choices about giving. And so here are some examples of what I call framing effects. So if we do the paper that I think was also instrumental in kind of drawing me into this. I actually was sensitive to what happened to me in Whole Foods because of this first paper by Lazier, Malmandier, and Weber, in which they do a very simple modification of the dictator game. So the dictator game is you can give 0 to your endowment. What they do is they add an initial stage that just says, do you want to make a choice about giving money to another person? And many more people will opt out of giving anything at all if you allow them to do so before having to state some number. Even though that's just the same thing as giving 0. So you haven't changed the set of choices that people can make at all. You've just framed giving nothing in a different way. Another situation in which people will give less involves uncertainty. So if there's a resolution of some uncertainty, say the payoff to a lottery or something like that is chosen after the dictator's action. So I'm basically deciding what kind of lottery am I going to give you. I will be much less generous in terms of the expected value of the lottery if the lottery is there than if I have a choice to give you some money for certain. Another thing is if I interpose another person in between the recipient of the money and the dictator. So if the dictator says so if the dictator says to the agent, give $2 to person X. Having that intermediation will lower the amount of money that people will give. And there's also this example of the contrast between effort and windfall that I'm building on here. And so, is there something in common among all of these framing effects? And it's I think that there is, and that the framing introduces some degree of ambiguity about what you're supposed to do, what norm applies to what you're doing, or there's some indirectness, the linkage between your own action and the outcome for the other person is made less direct. So that would be, say, through the uncertainty or through the agent. There's an indirectness that's introduced. And I promise I'm going to tell you about the design very soon, but I want to kind of get through some of these preliminaries first. So there's a very nice paper by Benabou and Tirole recently in the QJE that tries to provide a framework for understanding these different types of this sort of fragility of giving, why these framing effects are important, and they develop a little model that sort of says, sort of takes as given people want to perceive themselves as being pro-social. So that's a common value that many people have, is sort of being a pro-social person who would give to another. But their self-knowledge is imperfect. So I don't get a perfect signal of my type just through introspection. I learn something from the actions that I myself choose to take. So I think I'm a pretty good person, but then I cut someone off in traffic and I have to update my sense of like, is that really, that's, new information to me about who I am, which is not a very typical kind of micro model, right? To sort of have the agent who is making the decision then gaining information from what is decided and internalizing it. We don't usually have that sort of compartmentalized sense of the decision maker is usually this unitary entity. And so then if I take an action that's ambiguous or indirect, it's not as good a signal of who I am as a unambiguous action. And so if you kind of think about that in a Bayesian way, that noisy signal is going to result in less updating of my own sense of my type, whether I'm generous or not. Yeah.
Sorry, David. So I understand this kind of perception of themselves, but isn't it true that also they want to be perceived by others as being pro-social? Isn't that more important than what they think about themselves? So that it's indirect, and so, if there is a person in the middle, there is nobody that is really thanking me for my actions.
Yeah, so I guess that you could think of it that way as well. There's the question of, do I care what the person in the middle thinks about me? So I'm displaying my lack of generosity to another person. That person is, supposedly my agent, so maybe I think about that differently. But it's definitely true that there's a question of that the perception of being pro-social is important both in the world at large and I think to people internally. And so this is sort of also all related to the notion of cognitive dissonance in psychology, which has to do with the difficulty we have in dealing with contradictory information about actions that we've taken and our concept of ourselves. And so often that may, we may resolve that contradiction by sort of, ignoring the actions that we've taken and continuing to have the same self-concept, or we may be forced to update based on our actions. And so that also relates to this idea of this tension between kind of self-concept and the actions that we take is also sort of supported by a substantial literature that has, not sure exactly why, but has sort of come into this literature on negotiation in economics by Babcock and Lowenstein, but has a longer history in psychology, which is basically that we're going to selectively attend to information that is either positive about us or that has that suggests that we're going to get a higher payoff in the future. And so the payoff sort of question there is about, if I ask people to review information about a legal case in which they're going to be, in which they sort of are representing a side, and I'm going to compensate you based on whether you kind of guess what the judge is going to say about your case. Even under that sort of incentive, you're still going to sort of interpret the evidence in a way that's overly favorable to you, rather than another person. So we might think of overconfidence as a related sort of related phenomenon. I will, since I'm a male, I'm likely to say enter into a contest with an expectation that I'll win, even though that expectation is probably wrong. I'll have a inflated view of my competitive ability. So that's all rather. So this is sort of a kind of meta motivation. I'm not sort of testing. I'm not testing this theory, but I see this work I'm doing on mental accounting and giving is fitting into this sort of a framework. Okay, so what did I do? So I conducted this, what I call a framed field experiment, which is the terminology of Glenn Harrison and John List. So a field experiment that takes some method from the lab and embeds it in a more natural setting than undergraduates in a computer lab. And the setting is this online labor market called Mechanical Turk. I don't know how many of you have heard of Mechanical Turk or other kinds of online labor markets, but basically this is a sort of platform where people can get tasks done that only require sort of communication via computer. And so, for example, something like classifying images or producing tags or keywords for images. I can do that at my computer and look at an image and make some classifications for it, and then send that information to the person who wants the image classified, and there doesn't have to be any other intermediation between us other than just this electronic channel. So it's kind of a matching service for people who would like to do work online and other people who have work available. It's also used for things like data entry, transcription of audio, making comments on blogs. So if you have a blog and you want it to look really popular, you can hire someone to leave comments on the things that you post, and it will look like you have a lively following. And it's pretty cheap. Not that I used it for that purpose, but so you can have people do online or physical searches, and there are a sort of fairly sizable group of people in psychology, marketing, and economics who have been using this group of people to do either experiments or survey-based research. And so the way it works is that workers view lists of tasks that they might do with payments that they would get for doing the task. Most of them are short, so they might take anywhere from 30 seconds to half an hour to complete. Workers accept working on the task, they do the task, they submit the results, and then the employers review the results and pay them. And they can also pay them a bonus, which is important for me since that's the channel that I will use to pay people different amounts. So the subjects in the experiment are workers on this labor market who are based in India, so you can select the country of origin for the people who are working on your thing. And so I chose this population partly, in part because I wanted to be sure that the people were going to perceive money they earn as part of the experiment as actual earnings. I also chose it because in order to get a lot of variation in the windfall and earned income that people get to sort of study that mapping, I need to have a lot of subjects. So I have roughly 1,000 of them. It was it's much easier to find 1,000 people via this method than doing a lab experiment. And it's also the sort of payoffs are relatively substantial for this group compared to the sort of median wage, even kind of conditioning on the fact that many of these people are college graduates who are doing the experiment.
Isn't $10 extraordinarily high?
Yes, so it would put it for them. It puts them sort of in the well into the 90th percentile. So these are, partly I kind of wonder why everyone in India isn't crowding into this market, because you can get paid a lot of money.
I mean, even functional and being in the MTech marketplace, $10 is a lot of money, right?
Right. So I pay.
Like for American tasks, it's usually no more than $1.50 an hour.
I think that's. My sense is that I thought 6 was more common in terms of what.
I collected data for about a month this year.
Oh, and so you managed to get people.
Were paying.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And they were making $1 or $1.50 an hour on
The
average.
maximum we ever saw was like $2.50.
So I'm extremely. This is an extremely generously paid experiment then. My sense was that.
Well, the only reason I think
Yeah.
I would worry that might be perceived as the windfall, like seeing your task. That
Right.
is so outrageous.
Right, and so there's a sense in which I'm not. I don't think hopefully not in an internal sense, but at least relative to the other tasks that they could do, they will feel themselves very fortunate to be doing this one. So that's definitely definitely something to think about. So this is the set of just the sort of characteristics of the sample that I got. They're mostly young, in their early 20s, more males than females, and many of them have already finished some higher education. Most of them have finished secondary school. The vast majority of them have finished secondary school. A lot of them spend a substantial amount of time using this platform for their work. So they will, on average, the people who completed the experiment, on average, they worked about 20 hours a week on either Mechanical Turk or another platform like this. At the end of the experiment, I asked them about whether they found the English that I used in the experiment difficult or not. And generally, I tried hard to keep it relatively simple, but English is for people who are secondary school graduates in English in India, English is a pretty common a pretty common skill to have. So most people found the experiment easy to understand. And so the sort of gross characteristics of the design, are a division of the dividing the participants into dictators and receivers, and then the dictators have two ways of getting tokens, and the tokens are worth 3 cents each, and paid to them as a bonus. I think I give them 30 cents to accept the task, and then they can earn a varying amount from the 30 cents just as a participation fee, and then they can earn a varying amount based on their performance in a number matching task and a random draw for some additional tokens. And so on average, people are accumulating about $2 and 10 cents. And the range is, I think, about $1 to $8.10. So then the dictators are given an opportunity to not an opportunity, they're told that they have to decide how many tokens they'd like to share with the receivers. And I also asked the receivers to guess what they think they're going to get from some particular combination of earned and windfall tokens that actually will occur in the experiment.
Do they know they'll face BE before they start the test?
Do they know that they will face? They know that they have that there's another person that they're paired with. They don't know why, right? So they start off without knowing what the other side of the division is, what the other people are doing. They find out. Dictators find out after they've accumulated their tokens that there's this other that the other person who they know is there has not had a chance to earn anything or had a chance to get a windfall, and so any additional compensation that the receivers get depends on what the dictators decide to share with them. So they're and of course, it's all of this is anonymous. And in fact, even though they don't know it, it's asynchronous. But I don't make it clear to them that they might be able to infer it from the way the experiment works. But I need to sort of have all of the dictators' data before I can calculate and pay the receivers. So the receivers don't find out how much they're going to get until a bit later on.
When you said you had about 1,000 of these participants, that's about 500 of these pairs then? Or?
Yeah. So roughly 500. There's a bit of a little bit of a difference because of sort of attrition. People not completing the experiment, but roughly equal. And so this is sort of the sort of preview of the results, which I think will make, which I've sort of put together in a way that relates to the second slide I showed about the sort of sharing function, and so as we may have expected from the previous work, people are more generous with marginal tokens that come from windfall than those that come from earnings, and so that is kind of a replication of what the literature has said, although the literature hasn't really studied marginal giving. It studied average giving. The windfall and earn tokens are partly fungible with one another. which means that the sort of mental accounting idea is supported by the data, but not the sort of strong or strict version. So it's not that people treat these two different kinds of tokens completely independently of one another. If I have, 5 windfall tokens, it does matter how many earned tokens I have in my decision about what to do with that 6th windfall token. So these things are dependent on one another in a way that is sort of supportive of this idea of weak mental accounting. More interestingly, and I think what relates this to the literature on ambiguity is that in the situations where people or sort of have tokens largely from one source or the other, so if they were to have, say, 30 earned tokens and 10 windfall tokens, they will basically ignore marginal changes in that smaller bucket and only respond in their giving to changes in the big bucket. And so it seems as though they are selectively attending, if you'd like, to the account that's the largest and ignoring the one that's smaller. And so that means that, and so that means that people are sort of least generous when there is the sort of more complete mixture of the two. Yeah.
Are you experimentally varying the earnings as well, or everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
So the earnings and windfall are being varied experimentally. One difficulty with, and so the main kind of challenge in the design is that earnings are going to be correlated with ability at the task, and so the challenge is to figure out, well, how am I going to induce some random variation in earning? Windfall is easy; I can just randomly assign it, and as in the next part, I'll kind of describe how the design works, and basically what I'm able to do is I develop a design where I can use expected earnings and expected windfall from a particular cell that I place people into as an instrument for their actual earnings and windfall. And I'll show you how that works. And so the results are based on those kinds of estimations. So here is the tasks that people engage in where they're matching numbers. This is the work that they do. It's fairly, it's a simple task. So here what people have to do is sort of check the 24 and 76 boxes, because those are the numbers that sum to 100, and that's the instruction that they're given here. It's always selecting the two numbers that sum to 100 from a grid of 9. It's simple, but you have to, in order to sort of it requires some focus, and also I think that people who are able to requires focus, and there's a substantial variation in how good people are at this task. And so this is just a histogram, a sort of normalized histogram of the number of those matrices that people can solve per minute. And you'll see that kind of there's a range of about, well, this isn't quite as informative as the non-normalized one, but in any case, there's a substantial variation in how many of these people can do. And so this is basically what the question that Joyce just raised and that I tried to answer. We need to sort of make sure both that we don't want the amount that people earn to be correlated with their we want to find some variation in the amount that people earn, or generate variation in what they earn that's not correlated with their ability. And we also don't want the level of total earnings to sort of be correlated with how much, what share of the total earnings, sorry. We don't want the level of total tokens to be correlated with the share that come from earnings rather than windfall, because we may expect that the people's marginal willingness to give will probably change with different levels of income, so we don't want that confound in there. So basically we would like something like this graph, where we would like to have these cells of people who, say, earn 20 and have 10 as a windfall, and so have earned 67% of their tokens. We would like to populate all of these cells. And so then we can sort of see, as the earned share varies between 0 and 1, what's the, how does the marginal willingness to give change as we induce some random variation in that share. So the way, there are basically two ways to do it. I could have people doing the task and pay some people more for each matrix that they would get right, and other people less. That would, if I randomly assign the piece rate, that'll induce some differences. I can also, since I'm paying people, people will get paid more for completing more. I can change the duration of the task. So some people get to solve matrices for a long time and get paid more. Other people get to solve them for a short time and get paid less, and the average piece rate would be the same. I thought that and so the problem there is that, and so the reason that this is sort of an important question is that it's not going to be possible to have someone with the same ability earn different amounts of money without changing something about the experience that they are going to undergo in the experiment. So they're either going to have to experience different task durations, different piece rates. Something is going to have to differ for them, and the issue there is that maybe that is going to be a confound with the share from earnings. And so I chose to vary the task duration. You could also choose to vary the piece rate. I felt that this was going to be kind of a less likely to produce bias in the estimates. And so here are the cells. This is not all of the cells in which people are randomized into, but a selection of them. So people get randomized into durations of the task, 60 seconds, 120 or 180, and they also get randomized into getting a low, medium, or high windfall. And what low, medium, or high means, depends on the task duration. But it's in a fixed way. So these different cells have different expected payoffs from earnings and windfall that I can use as instruments in the estimations. When people do the task, I pay them differently depending on whether they were above or below the median, where the median is calculated based on a large pretest of the task. So I understand, if people are going to do the task for 60 seconds, I know that, the cutoff is going to be 8 or something like that. The median is going to be 8. So people who get above the median will get paid high. People who are below the median get paid lower. And then what the windfall payoff is the windfall payoff is lower in the low category than the medium or high, but you'll see it also depends on whether its actual level depends on whether someone was above or below the median. And that's just to sort of be able to fill in that nice set of green dots that that I showed you before. And so what we get is so variation in the earned share of income, where we have people who are, so we have, where the way I've designed it is that someone who earns 30, there will be some of them who are above median performers and get 30, people whose total tokens are 30 and for whom 33% of those were earned, so who had a total of 30, earned 10, and had a windfall of 20. Some of those will be below median performers and some of them will be above median performers. And the difference will be that they experience the task for different periods of time. And that's just to sort of try to keep the design as balanced as I could. So this graph just kind of illustrates this relationship between the sort of actual amounts that people end up getting in tokens, and in orange the cell expected values. And so this dot represents the expected token earnings and windfall for someone who did this task for 180 seconds and had the medium level of windfall. Where they go, whether they sort of are paid, whether they earn 30 or 20 from the task, depends on whether they score above or below the median in the task, and then from there, being in the median windfall group means that you get to 20, and it's hard for me to see. So you get to earn 20 and a windfall of 20, or you've earned 30 and have a windfall of 10. And so the design is it's a somewhat complicated design, but the goal is really to be able to fill out this set of green dots. Here's just a sort of similar example for another one of those cells. And so people do, I have 8 task durations, so from 1 minute to 20 minutes, sort of more of them, more concentrated in this sort of 1 to 6 minute range. There are also going to be some people who don't do the task at all and just get windfall. There'll be others who don't get a windfall at all and just do the task. And so if kind of thinking about all of these cells, there are going to be 29 if I were to try and populate all of them. I end up pruning out 4, so there are 25 cells that people are randomized into with different expected windfall and earnings, and they accumulate between $1 and $8.10 as dictators. Then they're faced with this screen, and I think that the framing here may be important. So I start out by reminding them of what the windfall, what their windfall was, then what they earned from the task and how much that amounts to in total, and then they get to decide using these sliders how much to give to their partner and how much to keep for themselves. These start off both being, I think they start off both being at 0, and yeah, they start off both at 0, so there's no blue bars here when they first see the screen, and then they have to drag them in order to have the lengths of the 2 equal 30. Otherwise, they're instructed to go back and fix it. Yeah.
You said it says your account had 10 tokens to start, but they don't get the windfall until they complete the task, right?
Right. And so
Is that the payoff just for showing?
yeah, I don't. I wonder if I've taken this from. I may have taken this particular graphic from an earlier version of the design. So yeah, so it should say that you earn 10 from the number matching task, and then earn 20, and then 10 were added. So I need to fix that. And so then I run just a simple regression of people's windfall and earnings on how much they share to be able to measure these sort of marginal coefficients, and I use the expected earnings and windfall for the cells that people landed up in as instruments for each of those. Yeah.
Just a quick question on the last screen. Is it always partner on top and myself on the
Yes.
bottom?
Yeah. I did not pilot to see whether that difference mattered. Are you thinking that if I...
You're talking about selective attention, these sorts of things...
Yeah, these sorts of things could also matter.
They do matter.
Yeah, so that would be another, I suppose that it would be ideal if what I find is robust to, at least in the differences between the 2 margins, to be sort of robust to changing the order, but I haven't tried changing it. So this is the basic sort of regression version of the results. So there are 487 dictators in the sample, and the first column just shows that regression where we see that the people are willing to share about a 13% of an additional windfall token on average, about 7% of an additional earn token. I also run the regression with sort of only those dictators who saw both the task and windfall, so I run it on the sample where I eliminate people who only did the task or only got windfall, and for the sort of first regression, unfortunately, nothing is particularly significant. But if I look at the subsequent columns, they're sort of more similar. So here we add in just the interaction of the 2, and this sort of shows us that when So the product of earnings and windfall for any given total amount is going to be highest in the sort of when the two are mixed. And so this is sort of saying to us that people are going to be, in general, less generous in the when earnings and windfall are mixed rather than at the extremes. And here I just add in some quadratic terms to allow the sort of shape of the windfall and earn token kind of dimensions to be different from one another. So this could be, this coefficient could just be picking up the fact that these marginal willingnesses to give sort of fall differently as the total increases. And here I can also add in sort of higher order terms, and it seems to be pretty robust. So that's sort of, and so this is that cross-partial derivative that I talked about, and so the fact that it's not zero and negative suggests that this weak form of mental accounting is what's at play here. But this doesn't give a whole lot of, looking at the averages doesn't give us a very complete account of the variation that I went to such trouble to try and create. And so, yeah.
On the last slide, just kind of a general question.
Yeah.
Just wondering why this isn't sort of a permanent versus transitory income kind of story.
So,
Like if, this is a small income shock, there's some cost to saving it or something, so I just kind of, spend.
so I would behave differently with this. And so where I would, so are you thinking about how behavior in the experiment might be different from the way people would behave with sort of permanent changes in income, or are you thinking that windfall is kind of like transitory and earnings are kind of like permanent?
The windfall is kind of like transitory.
Yeah.
There's that perception.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I mean, I think that we tend to have, earnings tend to be a lot more stable than, and more, I guess, closely related to permanent income than the various windfalls that we end up getting. So if we think about how people are behaving within the experiment, my expectation is that they're sort of seeing this whole exercise in a kind of compartmentalized way, and it's not, it's all sort of transitory in some sense. But if we were to think about, I guess, what in the broader context, how do we think about this trade-off between windfall and earned? It would be related to how people behave with transitory shocks versus permanent income. And so I'm not sure exactly and so if we were to want to try and, I guess, draw broader implications from this, then we would have to think about, I mean, you may know exactly what you're thinking. I would have to think about it more. I would have to think about it.
No, I'm just wondering
when
about
I'm sitting down in my office. But
versus the kind of permanent.
yeah, no, and I think those things are definitely, I don't know whether they're conflated or related to one another in the broader context.
Although I guess if the instruments are really removing that correlation with ability, then it's probably more consistent with mental accounting.
Yeah. So I think that I don't think that it's a problem for the estimation, but I think it is a question of how you would think about behavior with windfalls in the in the real world, where there's sort of this, maybe I treat windfalls as a different account, but maybe I also have, I'm also going to behave differently with transitory and permanent changes in income. So I would need to think about, that if I were to want to kind of apply this, to try and apply these results to thinking about sort of, say, giving patterns over a longer period for individuals. But I really see this as being kind of, I think that what you can take away from the experiment is fairly, at least what I would encourage people to take away from the experiment is really, I think, very closely related to the context in which people are asked to make decisions. So those, I see it much more as a framing kind of, paper. Yeah.
There's another way to think about windfalls. So here you're thinking about windfalls or just the absolute number of tokens. I wonder if the subjects might be shifting the reference point when you tell them you're going to earn 30 or 40 here. We're going to have a coin flip. When it comes up and I only get 30, that's actually a negative windfall in my mind.
And so I have so we would think about loss aversion and something like that.
So you could look at the two people that both earned 30 from the windfall, but one got it from a lucky coin flip and one got it from an unlucky coin flip.
And so in this version of the experiment, they don't know what the they don't know the alternatives that they could have been faced for the windfall. So I don't think that there's a reference point there. They're just sort of said, oh, and I say an additional like 10 tokens has been added to your account.
And it's all just in a black box.
Yeah, it's in a black box for them. But I think that there's but the reference point issue, I think, is also important. And so this just sort of shows the kind of interesting fact that I'm not really quite sure what to make of, that as the total, as the number of earned or windfall tokens increases, people tend to be more willing to not give anything at all, sort of just say zero, the more they have in either of these two categories. And so that is not entirely, it's not entirely intuitively clear to me why that happens, but that's sort of the extensive margin, if you like, of the experiment. What I really want to show is a set of graphs where I kind of wanted to. I want to say, well, how do these margins change when when the relative number of earned tokens to windfall tokens changes? So do I behave, I sort of see this negative sign in the interaction, in the regression, and I'd like to kind of understand something about how these margins change as we go from having most tokens windfall to most tokens earned. And the way that I do this is to do a locally weighted version of this regression, where the weights are based on the share of tokens that come from earnings, and are sort of given by this sort of usual kernel density local linear regression type formula. So this is kind of like doing your standard local linear regression, except you're not weighting by, say, the variable of interest and looking over its range. You're weighting by by this combination of the two. And so what that produces is this these two graphs, which show the point that I made earlier about, when someone has a low fraction of tokens from earnings and mostly tokens from windfall, they tend to be sensitive in their giving to changes in windfall, but not to changes in earnings, and vice versa. And so this is the graph that makes me sort of think that they're paying attention to the largest account. And so, right. And so I also did, like I do with the regression tables, I also sort of split this out, looking only at the people who saw both earned and windfall tokens. I'm stripping out the people who were sort of at the extremes, and the pattern is pretty similar. And so the question that then sort of occurred to me is, well, is this just about, is the framing effect here really just about having two piles of things and then asking a person to make a decision about stuff that's in two piles rather than one pile? So do we really need this difference between windfall and earnings to sort of get this behavior to show up, or is it sufficient just to say, okay, you'll get only windfalls, but I'll give them to you in two stages. So you'll have windfall 1 and windfall 2. Then you'll have two accounts, both windfall. Will you kind of get the same pattern of behavior? And I separated their learning about these windfall amounts by a set of demographic and attitude questions. So they actually did seem like separate events, which is the way that, more like what they experienced when there was both earnings and both earned and windfall tokens. And so here the pattern, we don't see the sort of change in the marginal willingness to give as the share of tokens from windfall 2 increases. So as the amount that you're told you got the second time around, or in the second windfall is sort of larger than the first one, the marginal willingness to give out of that first token is kind of pretty constant at about 0.12. Out of the second token, you're more willing to give out of the second one. And so maybe you feel more that maybe that seems more like luck to you. I don't know. I think that's there's something potentially interesting in the fact that people treat these two things a bit differently, which I think might have to do with perceiving the more immediate event as being more like luck, or more like, windfall 2 seems more windfall-y than windfall 1, which I wouldn't hang my hat on, but I think it's interesting to think about how people perceive sort of lucky shocks, and could be a direction for doing a different kind of experiment. So the expectations of receivers, and so I asked this set of questions of the receivers. What did they expect to get if their partner had windfall of such and such and earnings of something else? Mostly because it was, I didn't have sort of strong priors about whether people would be good predictors of the behavior of others, or not. But it was, I had to give them something to do. Otherwise they would, otherwise they would feel like they, well, it was low cost, so I did it. And so what I find here is that so the margins here are much larger than they are for the dictators. So the people are pretty over-optimistic about what they're going to get out of an additional token. And they seem to feel that when there's a mixture of earned and windfall, they're going to get more than when earned and windfall are separate. And so that's the opposite of what we saw with what the dictator's actual behavior was. But it's almost as if there's a way in which the behavior sort of seems like the dictators are sort of thinking that 1 + 1 is less than 2, and the receivers are thinking that 1 + 1 is more than 2. So there's they're interpreting this information in a way that seems to be, even though it has no effect on what is going to happen to them, they're more optimistic when they see 30-30 than when they see 60-0.
Do you ever control for total income?
So I can control for total income if I do the estimation using share in the total.
Right.
Otherwise, they're collinear, and I'll get sort of the same, basically the same pattern, but with a different, in a different dimension. And so this is this is not sort of perhaps not particularly well. I mean, the interesting thing here, I guess, is that in the left-hand graph, if people are mostly engaged, seeing that their partner got earnings and only a little bit of windfall, they're very optimistic about a marginal windfall token. They think they're going to get almost all of it. So they're, in a way, their perception of this is almost the opposite of what the dictators actually do. I'm not particularly surprised. This is the task that I'm asking them to do to sort of make this inference has really there's no real information that you can draw on to make this guess other than introspection, and no real anchor, I think, from experience to say how would 20-30 be different from 50-0. And so I'm not too surprised that they seem to be over-optimistic and sort of particularly sort of sensitive to small windfall amounts like that when people have earned most of their when the dictators have earned most of their total. And so the basic conclusions, I think, are those that are basically those that I went over sort of earlier. That the results of the experiment support this weak notion of mental accounting, and that the pattern, which is not something that I necessarily expected to see when I designed the experiment, is that there seems to be this selective attention by dictators to the largest source of income and low sharing out of the smaller one, though I think that's consistent with a bunch of the literature that I talked about, and that it matters that there's some real difference between these two accounts. It's not sort of a super mechanical kind of framing effect. And so I think that what do you do? I mean, what do you do with this kind of information? I think that although I don't see it as sort of directly applying, I don't think that you could take these results and confidently design a policy. You would have to do another experiment. But I think that in the sort of charitable solicitation world, understanding something about how your asking for money frames people's resources is an important question. And so that's where I see kind of the people who are going to be most interested in knowing about this are sort of those people. And so that's what I have to say. You've got 5 minutes. I'd love to take any questions or comments or yeah.
What would be the best way to frame
What's that?
What would be the best way to frame a question or to frame a question for people to be
So I think that you would, so there's a way in which you would think, well, luck would work pretty well because people seem to be, framing someone as fortunate would be this kind of first thing that you might think. But then I think the caution that the experiment gives is that, does that sort of put people more into this middle mixed source kind of a state where, yes, you've highlighted the fact that they're fortunate and they're more willing to give when they perceive themselves as fortunate. But they're probably not going to, this is a sort of, I should say I have no idea how you actually would do it, but I think those are the issues that you kind of have to think about. And I don't have the sort of, the answer for it, but you would have to think about, and you would have to test how, how these types of framing manipulations, emphasizing, people being fortunate or people being, say, productive or wealthy, that you should think about it, that you need to investigate how they work. So that's like a kind of slight half answer, half evasion, I guess. Yeah.
This may be more of a question for Thaler than for you, but what is the theoretical thing underlying these sorts of decisions? Are we saying that they've got a utility function that sort of depends on where I get my money from and how much I give, or is it constraints that are different? Or do they have some sort of constraints? What's going on?
Well, I think that you would, if you were to put it into sort of constraints, then someone would probably say, well, that really is kind of like taking part of the utility function and putting it into the constraints, because people have preferences that are about categories of income, and you should represent those as being part of the utility function. I'm not a theorist, so I don't know how difficult it would be to to sort of put that into, to sort of actually build a model that includes this kind of a, that includes mental accounts. Most of the empirical work tends to kind of take the fungibility question as the central focus, and doesn't necessarily think through, well, what new how do you modify theory in order to incorporate it. But I think you would have to put it into preferences somehow. Yeah.
Just a question about the framing. I'm wondering about the analysis of the receivers.
Yes.
They're overly optimistic. Do you think it's them being optimistic versus trying to play the system? Like, what if you were to ask them another question, say, if you get it right, how much, within a certain percent of how much you're going to receive, will give you an extra bonus? Like, maybe if I guess high, maybe I'll something where you don't have to actually.
Yeah, and I didn't incentivize it, and there was, there's sort of a, and there's this sort of experimental economists have a high, are very scrupulous about telling people the truth. And so I didn't want to tell the dictators that your choice about how much you give to this person is going to determine how much extra compensation they get, if they then have a chance to answer a compensated question about predicting what other people's behavior was. And so I don't know whether that was being too scrupulous or not, but I think that, probably, with an unincentivized question, I think that it's probably right that people were over optimistic in part because, they were not. I wasn't asking them to really think about it hard, and if I asked them to think about it hard, they might have answered it. And that's something that I could go back and do a little follow-up sub-treatment on. Might be interesting. Yes?
You also mentioned the sorting experiments. I think that'd be a really interesting manipulation to look at here.
And so where...
Right. If I have more windfall money, am I likely to sort out or something?
Right. So add the sorting stage here.
So not only predicting sorting, but then conditional on sorting. Do we see the same fungibility for windfall versus sorting?
Right. And so you might imagine that.
It might be very different for obligated giving versus preferred.
I think that's entirely. That's entirely possible, and I think that there's a, if you sort of think about, well, if we think about the motivational piece that comes from, ambiguity and cognitive dissonance, I may feel like, if I have a lot of earnings, I have a very good reason to opt out, which is that I earned this money, and so that may make the opt out much more powerful as an option for me, so I will still feel like, sure, I'm justified in doing that.
Thinking about the introspection, some of these mailers you get, right, they give you free address labels and then they ask you for money. Others ask you for money and then if you give them money, they give you a gift, right?
Right.
I would be curious if you would if people go to see two iterations of this and you randomize whether or not they were givers or receivers, and if there's some introspection and you actually see people that maybe overestimate how optimistic they are the first time, and then they actually get in a position where they have the money if that sticks or not. Just to think about how people actually solicit these charitable donations.
And so the difference between
having the money first and then giving it away
versus having the
fall and then just getting some money for nothing and then having the question what you would do.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's interesting, and particularly since it. It relates to these solicitation methods. I think it would be good to do too.
We should probably wrap up here. I'm sure David can hang around for a few minutes before we take him to lunch. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.